What's up, Rickies? This is the Rotation Ready series, and today we are starting Domain 1. But before we go any further, if you're new here, subscribe right now. This series is built on over 1,200 real preceptor feedback, real preceptor observations, and you don't want to start in the middle. And before I get into anything else, I need to say something first because I want you to hear this before you hear anything else in this domain. What I'm about to share with you is not a list of ways you have already failed. It's not a warning that you are behind. It is not proof that pharmacy school did not prepare you. Every gap that I'm about to talk about in this domain, I have seen in students who went on to become great pharmacists. Students who are now precepting their own students. Students who are doing incredible things in pharmacy. These gaps are normal. They are expected. And the students who grow the most on rotations are almost always the ones who walked in not knowing everything, but were willing to find out. First, let me tell you a story about a student I remember very vividly. First week of rotation, we were sitting side by side at our desks in the clinical room. She was getting ready to present her first patient workup before we went upstairs to round with the rest of the team. I could tell she was nervous. She had prepared, her notes were organized, her framework was in place. She moved through the systems. When she got to the endocrine system, she flagged the glucose somewhere in the 200s and said, the glucose is above goal. So I asked her, what's the goal? She answered the way you had studied, fasting 70 to 130, postprandial less than 180. She had memorized the outpatient glucose targets. She had never learned that inpatient goals are different. And for a patient in the ICU, different in a way that matters clinically, right? So I raised my eyebrow and said, are you sure? For this patient in the ICU? She paused, looked at her notes, and said quietly, actually, let me look that up before we go upstairs. I said, okay, good. Let's do that. Then we got to the cardiac system. The patient's home metoprolol had been held. She wanted to address it, which was the right instinct, right? She said the patient should be on guideline directed beta blocker therapy. When I asked her which beta blockers were appropriate for heart failure, she thought about it carefully and said, labetalol? I raised my eyebrow again, and she got that immediately. And she said, actually, let me look that up too and get back to you. Now, here's what I want you to understand. She was not wrong to try. She was doing exactly what a first week student should do. Showing up, attempting the work, staying in the conversation, even when the answers weren't fully there. But inside my head, inside the preceptor's mind, I was thinking, she should have known the inpatient glucose targets before she walked in. That is not advanced knowledge. That is basic preparation for an ICU rotation. And the beta blockers for heart failure? Carvedilol, metoprolol succinate, bisoprolol. Those three. Labetalol has never been on that list. She memorized that beta blockers and in olol without ever learning which ones actually matter in heart failure. I was not disappointed in her, but I knew that the first week of this rotation was going to be spent building the foundation she should have arrived with. And that meant we were starting there instead of somewhere further ahead. While we're reviewing inpatient glucose targets, we're not talking about insulin protocols and glycemic variability in the critically ill. While we're sorting out heart failure beta blockers, we're not getting into hemodynamic assessment, vasopressor selection, or managing a patient with both heart failure and septic shock. The students who come in knowing the basics actually get to the ICU part. The ones who don't spend the first week in a classroom we could have skipped. Now let's talk about why Foundations is domain 1. Foundational knowledge generates more preceptor feedback than any other domain. In my data across 1,200 plus observations, nearly 1 in 5 concerns raised about pharmacy students traces back to knowledge, what they know, what they have forgotten, and what they never learned durably enough to be there when they need it, to be here when they need it. Every other domain depends on foundations. Critical thinking requires knowledge to think about. Communication requires knowledge to convey. Documentation requires knowledge to record. A student who cannot recall basic drug information cannot fully assess whether therapy is appropriate, cannot recognize an interaction, cannot counsel a patient with confidence. Without foundations, every other domain has less to stand on. So this is domain 1, and this is where we start. There are 8 subcategories. Foundational knowledge is not one thing. The gaps that generate the most feedback cluster in the same 8 categories. Rotation after rotation, student after student. I call them F1 through F8. F for foundation, 1 through 8 for the number of 8 categories. Let's start with F1, nomenclature, your drug vocabulary, top 300 drugs, brand name, generic name, drug class. They need to be available in here in real time. And not just knowing that Xarelto is rivaroxaban, but knowing it cold when a patient says Xarelto and you need to act. F1 is first because it's the most immediately visible. Every presentation, every counseling session, every clinical conversation puts your drug name knowledge on display. F2, pathophysiology and disease state knowledge. Drug knowledge without disease knowledge is a tool without context. F2 gaps appear when a student knows the medication but doesn't understand the disease it's treating. If you can name the drugs used in heart failure but can't understand why acute decompensation changes the treatment approach, you have pharmacology without pathophysiology, and rotations expose that gap really fast. F3, drug interaction and pharmacotherapy knowledge. Knowing a drug exists is not the same as knowing what it's for. And knowing what it's for is not the same as knowing when to use it, when not to use it, and what makes one agent better than another for a specific patient. F3 is applied knowledge. It only exists when you can deploy it at the bedside. F4, dosing knowledge. A student who sees a drug name and a dose and just moves on without evaluating whether that dose is appropriate for this patient, this indication, this weight, this organ function, has a dosing gap. Knowing a drug is not enough. Knowing the dose for that patient is the job. F5, pharmacokinetics and drug properties. PK is not just a classroom concept. It's a clinical tool. A renally impaired patient on a renally clear drug, CYP3A4 inhibitor started alongside a narrow therapeutic index drug. An obese patient dosed on total body weight when adjusted body weight should have been used. F5 gaps appear when a student cannot connect a patient's clinical characteristics, clinical status, to how a drug is delivered, to how a drug will behave in that specific patient. F6, infectious disease and antimicrobial knowledge. Idea gets its own category because the stakes of getting it wrong are high. Missing spectrum of activity, recommending empiric coverage that doesn't match the infection source, failing to recognize duplicate antibiotic coverage. Antibiotic stewardship is not an advanced specialty skill. It is a foundation expectation on almost every rotation you will do. F7 is monitoring and lab interpretation. Every medication has parameters that tell you whether it's working, whether it's harming, and whether it needs to be adjusted. A student who completes a monitoring form without interpreting the labs is completing a task, just a task. But a student who interprets them is actually doing pharmacy. F7 is the difference between the two, a task and pharmacy. F8 might sound redundant, but it's general clinical baseline. This is the foundation beneath the foundation. Normal lab values, vital sign interpretation, basic disease state recognition, the clinical vocabulary that allows you to understand what is happening to a patient before you begin to contribute to what should be done about it. F8 gaps are the gaps that appear on day one of your rotation and set the pace for everything that follows. Does that make sense? I hope it does. 8 categories, 8 videos coming in this series. One goal: to make sure that when your preceptor asks, the answer is already there, at least 70% of the time. Back to my story about the student. That evening, after our first day of rounds, she sent me an email. Both answers, both sources. ICU glucose targets 140 to 180 for most patients. The evidence-based beta blockers for heart failure, carvedilol, metoprolol succinate, not tartrate, bisoprolol, and while labetalol, despite being a beta blocker, is not one of them. I wrote back, I said, good work, solid research, build on this. And she did. Every day of that rotation added something. A drug name she now knew cold, a dosing parameter she had looked up and would not forget, a concept that finally clicked when she saw it in a real patient. The gaps got smaller. The foundation got stronger. That's how rotations are supposed to work. You're not behind, you're becoming. And I'm going to make sure you have what you need to get there. Drop a comment. Which of the 8 categories do you feel least prepared in right now? F1 through F8. Tell me where your gap is, where you think your gap is, and that's where we're going next. If you haven't subscribed yet to my channel, please do so now, because this series is just getting started and you don't want to miss what's coming next if you want to be ready for your pharmacy rotations.